So we're going to just go to the next step. As we are validating, and we're going to start by looking at temperature for our wind chill, because if you look here, temperature is the first thing we ask for. And one of our issues with temperature is we need to enforce the idea it cannot be greater than 50, can it be less than 50. We need to be able to convert that field into an integer, but we only want to do it if it's not empty. So we're going to go ahead and write a method, and on this one, it's going to also be a Boolean. It's also going to be static. And this particular one is going to just be called isTemp valid. Or if you like to do it the Yoda way, it would be isValidTemp. And I believe my other tutorial did it that way. I think we're going to do this one the non-Yoda way. And okay, so it's Boolean, and we're going to validate the form. It will either return a true or a false. If it's true, then we can use the temperature variable to calculate wind chill, and we'll just need to do the same thing for the not only temperature, but is wind valid. And so we need to figure out what is the proper range of our temperature. What is the lowest temperature we can get a wind chill for? What is the greatest temperature that we can use a wind chill for? What are the upper and lower values? What will be within range? So the first thing we're going to do is figure that out. So I am going to go to the wind chill calculator, the online version that comes from the NOAA, National Atmospheric Oceanography, whatever it's called, something administration. It has to do with wind and weather. Okay, so we've got temperature. We have everywhere from -98 to 36 degrees. No, 40 degrees, excuse me. Oh, sorry. We have temperature from 40 to -45. So one of the things I did down here is I wanted to figure out temperature. So let's do 55 for our temperature. And right here, we need our lower range is -50. Our upper range is 50 on temperature. And then we'll do the wind speed in just a moment. So first thing, temperature valid. We're going to create some variables. And we're going to store those lower and upper values right in our model class. So when you're doing object-oriented programming, variables associated with a class are called static variables. And we're going to make these private. What private means, as opposed to public, you'll notice isEmpty is public. Private means we don't want any other piece of code in our program to be able to even touch this variable. We're protecting it because it's only needed for the working of the model. It's not needed in the rest of the program. So we make it private. We make it static. And then we're going to make it an int. And, oh, we need to give it a name. So we're going to call it lower temp range equals, what was that, -50. So we're not going to want to go below that. And then we're going to need an upper range. Now notice, through the wonderful world of code hints, I can start typing. If it's highlighting the right word, I just hit enter. And the upper range is 50 as well. Okay. So we're not going to allow the user to put temperatures below 50 or above 50. -50 and 50 are okay, but anything beyond that is not. So we're going to use those values for the rest. The next, what we're going to do is in our isTempValid, we need to do a couple lines of. The first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that the field is not empty, and we also need to pass it the edit text. And then we're just going to call it field like so. Okay. So that's all we need to call. And then we're going to get the length of this to find out if it is if it's empty or not. So if, now what we're going to do is, here's the interesting thing. We're inside of model, and we want to check if it's empty or not, passing it the field. So all I have to do is just write is empty. It's all ready to go because it's part of the model. It's sitting just a couple lines of code above. So we're going to pass it field. So here's the first thing. If this field is empty, we need to return. We're done with this. We know it's not valid. So we're just going to return a false if it's empty. Then we're going to do an else. And at some point, we're going to return true or false depending on the values. So let's take a look at how we want to do that. First thing we got to do is, can we take that field and actually convert it to an integer or not? All right, I'm ready now. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to try to parse it. Okay. Now we're going to store this as a value, but remember, if we try to parse it and it's not something that can be parsed, we need to, it's going to trigger an error, an exception, and we don't want that. So we're going to try to do this, and then if there happens to be a problem, we're going to return false. So it takes on the try-catch mode like this. So you try some piece of code, and then if there is an exception, call it exception E. Just going to give it a title E. We're going to return false. Okay. So what are we going to try to do? Well, we're going to try to parse it, and we're going to try to store it in a variable, which we will call data. Remember, we called that data before in the naming of the function. So we're going to write int data equals, and it's integer. That is a class. Parse int is the method. It's a static method because we call it from integer. And we need to give it parse int. Let's see, what does parse int do? It basically wants a string. So we're going to go to the field, and we're going to get the text. I'm going to convert it to a string like so. So we create the variable called data. Now, I just want to remind you, it's not empty. If it were empty, we would have seen that here. We would have gone out of this method. So anytime you do a return statement, if it matches a criteria like this, it's done checking it. We know now if we've gotten to the else statement, that's not empty. So our next attempt is to try to parse it to an integer. Now, at this point, if you cannot convert it to an integer, that's going to trigger an error. And that error will jump to this catch statement, and it's going to return a false. Okay? So next. Now, the other thing I want to point out is right here, you see that's red and underlined? And remember, that's because we're missing a return statement. One of these blocks of code is not returning a value. Can you see which one it is? That is inside of our try block. There's no return statement here. So it's still not satisfied until every possible block of code has a return statement in it. Now, before we can return true, we still need to check to see if it's in range. If, we got another if statement, and that's is in range. Data, we already have it. Now what we're going to do is we're going to do lower temp range, comma, upper temp range. Because I've created those variables up above, up here, they're now accessible within our code here. Okay? So if that is the case, and we are indeed within range, we want to return true. Notice, red underline still doesn't like the fact it's still waiting for something. It's waiting for a return statement. It's because we did an if statement. And by logic, we could say, theoretically, there could be where it matches the first couple of checks but is not in range. So at this point, we need our else block. Else, we're going to return false. At this point, red underline is gone because every possible path of code is returning either false or true. Now we got to test this out. Of course, I'm just going to save it because I made some changes. Now to test it out, we're going to check whether temp is valid or not. Okay, and we don't need this test anymore from before, so we just get rid of that. And now we're going to do if. Now we're going to go back to model. Dot is temp valid. We need a field. We have our field. It's edit temp. I'm just going to copy it right out of there, paste it in. Okay, well, if it's valid, we're going to put results plus equals okay, well, if it is valid, we're going to indicate that. Otherwise, else. So that's how we run it. Let's go ahead and test it out. I'm going to zoom out a little bit on the code so it's all on one line there, a little bit better. We go to test it, click OK, and let's see how it works. Okay, temperature field is not valid. Let's try 45. It is valid. Let's try 85. Not valid. Can we do negatives? Negative 55. Not valid. Negative 50. Valid. So we've just enforced all the rules and we've proven that it works. But we're still lacking one thing. Well, we're lacking two things. One, we need to do the same thing for wind speed. Two, not only do we have to do it for wind speed, but we need a way of kind of indicating what is going on if it's not valid. So we'll do wind speed first. Let's get that cranked out. That's going to be easier. But for that, you're going to have to wait for my next video. So stay tuned.